Welcome, everybody. I know we've got a lot of friends and family and neighbours all in tonight on all the various social media channels, and of course our lovely Seed members who are here in the Zoom room with us. So welcome, huge welcome to Catherine Mayer and her mother, Anne Mayer Bird. It is wonderful to have you here. I mean, it's a real gift to have you here. And we're going to be talking primarily about your book, your bestseller. See all my notes in there. Your bestseller, Good Grief, which is absolutely climbing up the charts. Well, it has climbed up the charts, and it's been written about in lots of newspapers and magazines. I've heard you, Catherine, on lots of radio shows. Enormously important book. And I was sort of starting to tell you just before we came on air that I've had this beautiful book with the two of you sitting on the sofa there, on my table, ready for me to read for the last few weeks. And I pick it up and I think, oh, I'm not quite ready. And I put it down again. And I have read and immersed myself in it from cover to cover for the last few days. And it is such a gift, this book. It is such a gift to everybody that reads it. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But just to do a little bit of history, because Catherine, you and I have known each other for a while, originally through my daughter-in-law, Monique, who's a friend of yours. And I've been in and out of your life in different ways. In fact, I think I did meet Anne at one of your book launches at some point. I think it was.
You would have done.
I think,
yes.
If not two.
I went to all of them. So.
Yeah. No, I remember seeing. I've never quite, as I was saying earlier to you, I've never quite understood. You've got such an extended family of sisters, half sisters, nephews, and stepfathers, and fathers, and stepmom, and all that. And I never understood it. I now know it all. I totally know the Mayer family. I understand everything now. And just thinking of all the different times that we've been connected over the years. Of course, not only personally, you threw the party for my daughter-in-law's bridal gathering before she got married. So that was, I think, probably the first time I met you. And then there were different times you interviewed me for one of your books about people wanting to stay young and alive forever.
You and my mother are both in the same book, Immortality.
Immortality is a brilliant book.
About age and aging and people who defy those, which both of you in pretty similar ways do.
Well, we were just talking before you came on, your mother and I, about how we're so in the technology world now, and I'm in my 70s, she's in her 80s, and we're on the Zoom and we're here and there and social media, and it's extraordinary how life is. Yes, I guess we are. We are very much still in that whole place of, I think the whole book, the premise of the book was that it's about how young you feel inside and how you're mentally young. And anyway, brilliant book. The thing that when I did start reading this book, the first thing I want to say is, Good Grief is the title, Embracing Life at a Time of Death, but it is a book about love. It is a beautiful book about love. It is a look about the love story between you and Andy Gill, your husband, who passed away, well, now a year ago, I guess.
It's the 1 year anniversary on Monday, so I'm just steeling myself against that.
Yeah, I thought it was about that. And then Anne, your husband, John Bird, passed away about 40 days before Andy. Yes. So it's about your love story and your letters to John since he died in the book, which are just beautiful. And because you are such an eloquent, engaging writer, Catherine, it drew me in immediately. It wasn't like I was sitting on the edge of this book, sort of peeking in at your life. It completely engaged me, not only because I know you, love you, think you're an extraordinary human being anyway, but the book really I felt wrapped up in it in a positive way. The love story also, I may say, between you and your sisters, your stepsisters, your extended family in every direction, your friends. I mean, you are surrounded, and you talk about this at the end of the book, Anne, which we're going to come to, about the richness of your life and the love that's in your lives in every direction. And the love affairs that you both had with your husbands, your husband, Andy, who you were with for 30 years, and Anne, you was with John for more than 40. Yes. It's not a love I've ever experienced. And I felt, I didn't feel envious, but I felt sad for me that I have never had that beautiful connection with somebody in full partnership that you two had and have. I mean, that's the whole point. about it, isn't it? It's not that, you know, it all stops. It continues on, and that love continues to be there, and that's what comes out of that book. So before I start getting all mushy, I've got my tissues right here. So it was quite interesting. I don't know if it's, I guess it's modern day culture generally, not just the British, that we don't like thinking or talking about death. We don't accept the fact that every one of us is at some point going to get there. And with indigenous cultures where, or somewhere like Mexico, for example, where death is part of the culture, and the Day of the Dead, when people go to the cemetery and with the flowers, and it's talked about and it's part of life. I mean, that's the whole point. But we don't like talking about it over here. And you two have both referred in the book to the death cafes that started getting quite abundant in a way around the country over the last few years. Obviously are on hold now with COVID, where people would come in to, I guess, slightly more conscious communities and talk openly about death and dying. But it's something we don't do, and that is why we are not prepared for it. And I'll come back to it a little bit later, but you know, just the practical aspects. And my mother passed away 2 years ago, and I had absolutely no idea what I needed to do, none, zero, and I was responsible for it all, and we just don't get told. So I know that as much as anything, you want this book to be there to help other people from a practical perspective, as well as your personal story. That's what I took from it anyway. So what I wanted to say was also, I mustn't forget to mention, I've got it down here, I've got my notes, the Women's Equality Party, because when Catherine, for those of you who don't know, was the co-founder with Sandy Toksvig of the Women's Equality Party, which is an amazing organization, a political party run by women for women, which came out of a group of women getting together in the bar at the WOW conference. How many years ago?
2015.
Well, 5 years, 6 years ago.
Yeah, we're coming up for our 6th birthday in March. Because
I was somewhere in the building that day, I think. I was at WOW that day. And I remember afterwards hearing about it immediately afterwards. I'm not sure if I was in the bar or not in the bar at that point, but it was an idea. You said, I know. You said what you said. I remember clearly you said.
Well, but I wasn't proposing to start a party. What I said was, perhaps what we need is a women's equality party. If anybody wants to discuss it, I'll be in the bar. And lots of people followed me there. But I remember, Lynne, that you're actually one of the first, not only a founder member, but you're one of the first founder members, because Sandy and I were with you when you were trying to get through on the phone and sign up. So you must, I don't know what membership number you are, but I'm guessing you're below 100.
Yeah. No, I remember sitting there thinking, I think I just sold my house, so I was feeling one of my house, as I was something I constantly do. I was feeling flush, and then the big benefactor. Oh yes, and sort of putting some money in, and I don't regret it for 1 second. I think it was worth every penny and more. I think the Women's Equality Party is of enormous importance in this country and has done great things to bring awareness into women's rights in many, many areas. And of course, now you've got Prima Donna, which we can talk about a bit later. You're one of the co-creators of that, which is a project you're very involved with now, but we'll come on to that. So let's go back to the book. So I didn't know Andy very well. I probably knew you a bit better, but he was always incredibly friendly and open. I was always felt slightly nervous, which is silly because he's the last person to feel nervous of, but because he was a famous pop star, I always get nervous of famous pop stars. And so I felt slightly intimidated, but I just wanted to share something with you, which was really important. I noticed so much time. I happened to be in the room, not with you, but coincidentally in the room at a big journalist awards dinner, which was black tie, and you got given, what was it, the International Journalist of the Year, was it?
God, that's a long time ago. It was Story of the Year, I think. Yeah, it
was something big, and Andy was of course with you, and he was in black tie, and you were all dressed beautifully in black dress, and I just happened to glance at him as you went up to get the award, and we sort of locked eyes. I think we were a few tables away, and the look of love on his face and pride was just beautiful, and I've never forgotten that. So I'm not saying that just to be sucking up. It really got to me, and I thought, wow, what a what a beautiful connection that you two had. And I was supposed to go and meet you once at I can't remember which rock venue to see Andy play, and I don't know what happened that night, why I never got there, but I didn't, and I regret that. But I'm quite sure the same look was on your face when he was up on the stage. So do you want to tell a bit about your story? I mean, I've got lots of questions, but I mean, I don't, you know your story better than I do. Do you want to talk about it, and then we'll talk to Anne a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I can also, I mean, I can set the scene for how we ended up writing a book together, because I mean, I think you're absolutely on point in describing it as a series of love stories. And I would also say, you know, at the risk of being a bit schmaltzy, it's a love story between me and my mother too.
Yes, I meant to say that one.
But what happened was that we were both very lucky to have these relationships. We always knew we were lucky. You know, the moment I met Andy, literally the moment I met him, I kind of knew that I was going to be with him, and there was never any messing about with it, never any game playing. You know, I met him at a party the following Saturday. I went out to dinner with him, and I was never separated from him after that moment. And I think with my mother and John, the beginnings of it are a little bit messier, but that same sort of sense of it doesn't sound romantic in the way that people expect it to, but a kind of solidity and security where you just know you are meant to be with that person. We both had, and Andy and John, although on the surface seemed very different, you know, John was a businessman. He came from a sort of different generation and different background, and Andy, of course, was this groundbreaking musician. But actually, John wanted to be a musician, became an artist, and the thing that they also really had in common was this utter lovability, that they were sort of people of that people just gravitated to both Andy and John, and of course they loved each other. So,
and they loved our family.
They loved our family, and
they really loved our family, which is, you know,
and we're loved
for some.
we're loved by them. But so, I mean, I also would say that the relationships mirrored each other in the sense that, you know, my mother has never stopped working. I can't ever imagine stopping working. And we were with men who, rather than being threatened by that, were, you know, appreciated that and were extremely supportive of that. So we, you know, but then the background to writing this book, of course, is John had been ill for a considerable time, but we didn't think that he was dying. And then in December of 2019, he was admitted to hospital. And around the same time, Andy had been on tour with his band, Gang 4. And he came back from his tour. The last country of the tour was China. And he came back from the tour, and around that time was when John went into hospital and suddenly declined quite fast and died on the 22nd of December. And so around that time, when I was doing my best, as my mother will know, to support her, and you know, my sisters and I sort of, you know, converged, and sisters, I'm including my stepsister in this, we're collectively sisters. We all took on different roles, and we were going to do this. And I sort of, in a way, didn't realize how ill Andy himself was becoming around that time, until he and I went on a long planned break at New Year. We went away for a couple of days, and while we were away, I suddenly realized that he was breathless in a way I'd never seen before. And I mean, he had asthma all his life, and he had what they now always call an underlying condition. He had something called sarcoidosis, which affected his lungs, but it hadn't been a bad or difficult thing. And suddenly he was really ill. And when we came back in January, he didn't want to going to hospital, was very resistant to getting medical attention because he wanted to keep touring, and he had all these big music projects going on. He had an album which I've in fact spent the last year getting ready to release, and so he thought that if the outside world knew that he was ill, it might sort of cause difficulties, it might deter people from booking him. So he kind of resisted going and seeking medical attention, and then one day I called the ambulance for him. He got taken to hospital. He was told when he was that his oxygen was dangerously low, but he was told he was the healthiest person in intensive care, and they expected him just to spend like a day there, be stabilized, and then be released. And instead, even though they were able then to identify a particular strain of pneumonia he had, a whole series of things happened where everything went against the expectation of the doctors, and he just he got worse and worse, and then they put him into a coma, and 5 days later they asked me to agree to them switching off life support. I only later came to realize and came to discuss with the hospital the probability that he was one of the first victims of COVID in this country, having been on tour in China. And at a later date, it became obvious that a lot of the symptoms and everything he exhibited were very COVID-like, which of course then raised questions about the speed of John's decline as well. And it meant that we were widowed within 41 days of each other, and then, of course, locked down. So we went straight from fresh widowhood to losing the loves of our lives to being locked down. And at that point, I began to visit my mother once a week as a caregiver under those rules of caregiving. As you will see this evening, my mother is not, she doesn't fit people's preconceptions of a woman who needs care, but she'd never lived on her own before. There are some things she really doesn't know how to do and needs help with. And so even now I go every Sunday and do things. And while this was happening, long story short, she began writing letters to John to explain to him all the extraordinary and terrible things that had happened in the world since his death, including the death of Andy, including the pandemic, including lockdown, a world he wouldn't recognize, even though it was only a month or so, 3 months. And around that time, when she'd shown me the first of these letters, my publisher came to me and said, "Why don't you write a memoir?" And I blogged, but I blogged exactly, this is so weird, exactly the same day she wrote her first letter to John. I wrote a blog post. And the reason I wrote that blog post was because Andy was a public figure. And so there was a lot of interest in him. And I kind of counterintuitively did it to preserve my privacy, because everyone kept asking me that dread question, how are you?
Which I made sure I didn't say tonight.
I know, and but also they wanted to know, had he died of COVID?
Yeah.
You know, why he'd suddenly died like that. And so rather than try and answer people individually, I wrote a very long blog post about what I thought at that time had happened. At that time, I was saying he didn't have COVID. But the point is that the publisher came to me and said, I should write a book. And I said, I don't want to write a book. It's way too early, but look at these amazing letters my mother is writing. And she went away, read them, came back and said, I really want to publish these letters. They're fantastic, but you need to write the book that wraps around these letters. And then at that point, I thought, oh, well, I'll see if I've got something to say. And it turned out that I had quite a lot to say. But I always wanted the letters to come out, and I'm so glad that they have.
They're beautiful, the letters. And I've asked Anne if she'll read a little bit from them in a minute. If one of the two.
Just interleaving with that, I might say that I wrote to John because suddenly finding myself walled up in my house in March last year, I don't know why. I just thought I have to tell someone what I'm going through, and who more logical to tell than John, to whom I told everything, and he was alive. So, and I found after I wrote the first one that it was very, not cathartic, that's the wrong word, but it made me feel better, more connected, more sort of, I don't know. I loved writing to him. And so I then started writing. But going back on what Catherine said, 3 days after John died was Christmas 2019. And Catherine and Andy, who are he was and she is the outstanding cooks in our family, did Christmas dinner for the family. And I ended up sitting next to Andy. And I didn't say anything to Catherine at the time, but I thought, he is really not well. And I had been so wrapped up in my husband dying, I hadn't even thought about Andy. But I sat next to him during Christmas dinner, and I suddenly thought, this man is really, really, really not well.
Mm.
And I think that it really landed in my consciousness.
Mm.
Not that he was going to die, but that he was certainly not himself.
Yeah. This whole aspect of COVID, because you're a journalist, Catherine, a very good journalist, is a big, well, not a big part of the book, but there's a substantial section here on what was going on generally with COVID, not purely what could have happened, because Andy had been touring in China, and you did then go into a lot of research with his doctors afterwards to try and track down if he did have COVID. But also the general situation, which I thought was very informative, and really very important, actually, looking in, particularly in the UK, at how people in care homes had been treated. You have a friend who runs one or works in one, and the mistakes that were made over here. I mean, it's very easy to always blame everybody, but clearly we were very slow off the ball here, and that's why a lot of things happened. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you're a member of a Facebook group as well, aren't you, of people that you talk about that in the book?
Yeah, the COVID bereaved families for justice. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have to say, when I realised that Andy may have had COVID, it was only because at the outset the timeline said that it couldn't be possible, because at that point, you know, the idea was this was in Wuhan only, and it was only discovered there in December. And although he'd been in China, he hadn't been in Wuhan, and it supposedly hadn't come to Europe. Now, there's an awful lot of evidence now that that is not true, that it was here much earlier. And there's actual proof, not just evidence, suggested evidence, but proof in terms of blood samples that were taken back in December of patients in hospitals that show either COVID infection or COVID antibodies. So it is now proven that those timelines were wrong. And when the first of those stories began to break, I went to Andy's specialist, and I just said to him, "You'll think I'm mad, but do you think it's at all possible that Andy had had COVID?" And the specialist completely winded me by replying that the hospital was in fact investigating that very thing and had been doing so for 6 weeks, and they thought he very well might have done. And they were trying to find the suitable samples for testing, which they were never able to do. But my feeling about this is the reason I pursued it. And it was interesting writing that part of the book, because the rest of the book is so much, both the way my mother writes to John and the way I write is unfiltered and very personal. And the chapter on COVID is the one bit where I went back to my comfort zone as a journalist.
Clearly.
Like, oh, I can
research this.
Yes. But why I was doing it and why it matters is it doesn't make any difference to me personally whether what killed Andy. The fact is that Andy's dead, and that's the thing I have to live with. But it does make a difference to the way that this situation is being handled and mishandled. And I felt compelled to document the ways in which it had been mishandled last year, because it keeps meaning that there are avoidable deaths. And for me and for my mother, each death in this pandemic, each set of statistics, you know, we passed that milestone of 100,000 deaths the other day. And we know it's not 100,000 deaths because we know that there were people who weren't counted. We don't, you know, we can't say for certain whether, you know, it applies to Andy or John, but there were definitely people who were not tested, who didn't fall within the testing criteria, including people in those care homes. And each one of those deaths is a personal tragedy for the person who dies and for this whole universe of people who love them. And so I joined the COVID bereaved Families for Justice, who were asking for a public inquiry, not to do the thing that public inquiries are so often used for, which is to kick the can down the road, but exactly the opposite, to learn useful lessons and implement them. So to have a rapid review phase. And also to, another thing they campaign for is the appropriate kind of mental health support, because there are so many people out there grieving. And you mentioned at the beginning that this is a culture that doesn't deal well with death, where people aren't prepared for it. And the kinds of deaths that are happening in the pandemic are not just ones that cause grief, but ones that cause trauma, because people have the person they love ripped away from them. They're not allowed to be at their bedsides. They're not allowed to commemorate them in ways that you would normally expect. And then, as my mother and I too well know, I mean, we don't get to, we're living on our own. We don't get to touch people. We don't even hug each other. The only times I've been touched during this pandemic, weirdly, have pretty much been people being hostile and angry. And the last time I got touched was somebody mugging me for my phone.
I read that on Facebook. That was,
you know, but it's a, it means that the kind of the universe we're in, there needs to be lessons learned to prevent more deaths, and there needs to be the kind of support. And as you can tell, we're doing okay, but we're lucky in all sorts of ways, including being sustained by the great love that we had for Andy and John and that we have for each other. But there are a lot of people who aren't that lucky.
You briefly talked then about getting mugged, and I know you said in the book that the first time you had any physical contact with somebody after the whole COVID was when somebody actually pushed into you in a queue in a shop or something.
Yeah, my mother had somebody. What was that guy in the shop telling you who pushed?
Yes, I had similar. I was checking out some groceries in my local convenience corner shop, and just a very small counter. And I saw this arm. I will not mention the color of the arm, but reaching around me, putting groceries down at the very, very, very same time. And I sort of expected the person, you know, who was actually behind the till to say something, but he didn't. He just sort of went blind. So eventually I had to confront this person because he was also standing very close to me. And I turned around and I don't know, I said something. And he suddenly asked me, I said, you have no respect for social distancing. I'd like to survive. This was quite early in the lockdown. And he said, well, how old are you? So I told him I was then 86. And he said, well, you should just die. Why bother? He basically said, if you're 86, just go out and die.
That's just terrible. And you also had a very nasty experience with somebody trying to con you on the phone to get all your data.
Oh, yes.
There's been a lot of that, hasn't there? One particularly one. So do you think that the world is getting crueler? Or, I mean, you're both in London. Is it a London thing? I'm not saying people are so sweet down here in Somerset, but I certainly haven't seen anything like that here. People are respectful.
Say what I think is that having read in so many places how wonderful everyone is being in World War II spirit, I could say a very rude word, but I won't. But
I think there's a lot of anger out there, and it comes out in different ways.
People are behaving appallingly, but I think they are angry. I think there is anger.
But I think people are right to be angry, and it's funny because...
But not for other people.
No.
Well, it depends what you mean. I mean...
well, can I just interrupt you before you tell one of your stories back to you, Catherine, about when some young boy, you had your headphones on, and he's made some abusive remark to you, and then you went running after him to find out what exactly he was saying and why he was saying it, and scared him off, and he just kept running. I mean, do you want to?
Well, that was a sort of similar one. That was just a sort of random bit of abuse on the street where he asked me something and I couldn't hear him because I was wearing headphones. So he for some reason thought that I was being rude to him or mocking him, but he just suddenly came out with this very bizarre, random anti-Semitic comment, which, given that I think at the time I was wearing sunglasses, headphones, a hat, and possibly a mask. So the likelihood of him actually realizing I was of Jewish descent was quite small. I think it was just a random drive-by anti-Semitic comment. But my point is not that those things are justifiable anger or anything else, but one of the things, you know, we heard this terrible thing at the beginning of, we heard this sort of, not terrible thing, but this terribly misplaced idea at the beginning of the pandemic about COVID being a leveler and how it would affect everyone. That is absolutely, totally untrue. Although we can all be infected by it, we've seen that, you know, and I'm saying this because I slightly winced at my mother's phrase, I won't say what colour the arm was. I mean, we have seen Black and Asian communities much harder, much worse affected.
Much worse here. The BAME community has been terribly badly hit.
Because of the structural inequality that is there. And you see, and again, I mean, in the pandemic, it's been interesting for the Women's Equality Party because there has been so much about the ways in which lockdown has affected women in different and in many ways worse ways, you know, the rise in domestic abuse, but also just the expectation that women would somehow manage to do a lot more. I was just reading the statistics on homeschooling and like how much more of the supervision that women end up taking on and how much more of the care work. So all of these inequalities that were already there, instead of COVID being a leveler, it's been the other way around. It's exacerbated them.
Yeah.
So I think people are frightened, which makes them hostile.
Yes.
And I think people are angry because they actually see in this pandemic that some lives are judged to be less valuable than others. And I think every older person in this country should be bloody furious at the ways in which that kind of drumbeat of, oh, they were old, so, you know,
they don't matter.
If they already had a life, you know, that drumbeat of underlying condition that somehow consigns anyone who isn't 100% physically able to being less valuable. That's where I think.
Well, again, it's in the same way that we as a culture don't talk about death, we also don't venerate us seniors, and that is also not the same in so many other cultures where the elders are venerated and are looked after and are cared for and live with the families and are treated with respect. And of course, that we don't have that either. There's a lot of things wrong with our society, and I did feel with all the terrible things that are happening, maybe. Well, I don't say maybe, I say, is this an opportunity, if we come in on a very conscious level, that we can create change so that we can alter the way things are, not go back to what they're calling, the politicians are calling the new normal, but create a new kind of world, a new kind of future, a future for my beautiful grandchildren to grow up in, where we can do things a different way, where women can become leaders in community, where we can look at education, agriculture, all the things that, and consumerism, of course, most of all, capitalism, and do things in a different way. That's what I'm passionate about. And with all the sadness that's there, and obviously personally sad for you, and on a general level, and the anger and the trauma and the mental health, there is also an opportunity for change. And I'm holding on to that. I'm just holding on to it. I'm not letting go, because that's why I feel I'm here. And I think we all are. I mean, we're all activists in our own way. And you've made lots of points in this book, which I think are very, very relevant. Back to a personal level, both of you have experienced losing not only your beloveds, or as you refer to Andy all the time, as the lovely dead on your Facebook page, which the first time I saw that, it really obviously grabbed my heart, and I see it referred to all the time. It's #LovelyDead, and it's very beautiful. But you've both, I was of Anne reading your story, which is that you are American, and you lost your father at an early age, at 12, and then your brother very early, and so there was this kind of sadness that you grew up with as a young woman, which affected you. I don't know if you want to share any of that, and then.
Well, I mean, it's just my father died of a coronary when I was 12, and he was only 41. no warning as far as we knew. And my brother and I saw him die because it was a Sunday morning. We'd gone into our parents' bedroom to sort of bounce on the bed that people often do. And my dad suddenly put his hand sort of on his chest and said to my mother, Ruth, I don't feel very well, and went over like a tree. He just went over and lay there, and we knew he was dead. It was the most extraordinary experience. And my mother was incredibly calm. She got us dressed and took us next door. And that afternoon, she came over next door and said, I hate to tell you, your father is dead. And of course, we knew it. We'd known it since 9:30 that morning. 2 years later, my brother had been sent off to summer camp, which is a big American thing, to send kids to camp. He was off in Wyoming having a wonderful time at a called Teton Valley Ranch. And the boys were having a barbecue, and a thunderstorm came up very suddenly, as they do in the high mountains. If you're familiar with the Rockies or anywhere, you can get blue sky 1 minute and a thunderstorm the next. And the boys were running to a shelter that was somewhat, and a big forked lightning just came down, and that was that. So he was then 12, and I was 14. And it was almost 2 years to the very day that since my father had died. So my mother had to cope with this double tragedy and a very beastly teenage daughter who wasn't very nice to her, unlike my wonderful daughter who supported me so brilliantly through this. I was not. I just wanted to be like everyone else, and I suddenly had half a family. I'd had a mom and a dad and a brother, and suddenly I had a mother, period. And I feel very remorseful all these years later that I was just so unhelpful and unlovely to her. And I just sort of couldn't, I don't know, I found it very difficult to accept. And then I
didn't have any support. I mean, again, talking about support, it's like the two of you just somehow muddled through with that amount of loss. I don't find it at all surprising that you had a strained relationship.
But then many years later, she married a wonderful second husband whom I adored, and he died of Parkinson's, so I lost him too. So quite a lot of loss. And then in very recent years, as I'm sure Catherine will tell you too, we lost John's elder daughter,
Sarah,
to ovarian cancer. We lost another member, someone that we were all very close to. And then we lost John, and then we lost Andy, all within about 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely terrible. And for you, Anne, this is the first time in your whole life that you've actually lived alone. And this was your big fear, as far as I understand from the book. This was a huge fear for you to live on your own. And in fact, now we're in a world where lots and lots of people are living on their own because we can't go out. And you're finding that it's not as terrible as you were imagining, and in some ways you quite like your space.
I've grown to like my space, and I've grown to like my own company, which was quite a change for me. And I am assisted not only by Catherine, but my bubble, our neighbors, and they have been extraordinarily kind. If I say that the male half of my bubble was on my roof in the pouring rain today, putting a piece of lead flashing back, which had been blown off. I mean, there are things I just can't do and never will be.
I don't think going on the roof and putting on some lead flashing is a particularly recommendable thing for you to do any more than for any of us, I think. But yeah, so it's interesting what comes out of situations. And Catherine, for you, of course, the loss of family, but you were also very close friends with Paula Yates, and Andy was working with Michael Hutchins, and that was very traumatic at the time. And you've recently done one bit of work that you wrote about that you were doing is you've done a present. What was it exactly? Not a one-woman show, but some kind of.
Well, it was. So what happened was the Globe Theatre did a series of monologues about women who had been erased or misrepresented, and they asked me if I wanted to write and perform one, and I instantly thought of Paula Yates because, and it's interesting because, of course, I mean, I met your daughter-in-law because she was working for
Paula, and your Tiger's godmother, and Moni was looking after her. Yeah.
Monique was looking after her and was one of those people who was there in the middle of the most traumatic circumstances possible at an impossibly young age and dealt with it incredibly well. But, you know, it was my first real run-ins with grief were when Michael and then Paula died in quick succession, and we were very close friends of theirs. And it was a very odd one because the outside world had so many preconceptions about both of them and ideas that dehumanized the whole grieving process, because people were just interested to know about them and didn't see them as human or understand our relationships as being like true friendships. And so it was odd and intrusive. And so when I was given the chance 20 years after Paula's death to write a monologue about who she really was as opposed to how the world saw her, I jumped at the chance. But then I couldn't perform it because I had written it and I, you know, got ready to perform it. But it was the 29th of January that I was supposed to perform it at the Globe Theatre, and of course Andy's life support was turned off on the 1st of February. So at that stage she was already in a coma and there was no question of me leaving his bedside. And the actress Stella Duffy performed it.
Monique's aunt, in fact. It's all very family and tribal, isn't it?
Small world. But I felt it was really interesting writing that, because I think one of the things one does with grief sometimes is one tucks it away. And it was only when I started writing that, and obviously it was in difficult circumstances when I was writing it, but it just, all the grief for Paula came absolutely flooding back, and it would have made it very hard to perform it. Having said which, I was mad enough in the immediate aftermath of Andy's death to think that I was capable of then fulfilling a promise to perform that monologue at a fundraiser for Prima Donna Festival, which I did do, but I can remember almost nothing about it except that I wept all the way through. You do mad things when you're
grieving.
Grief is like a big underground lake, because I haven't thought as much about my mother and brother for years as I have since John died.
Exactly.
I think if you think of within yourself, all the people you've lost are somehow in this, well, underground lake. I can't think of any other way to describe it. And you tap into all these different experiences that you've had. Because I've thought a lot about John's daughter too, who Catherine and I both adored. Sarah, she was called. Such a promising person, cut down.
She sounded amazing in the book. I mean, I could go through every detail in the book, but there's so much in there, and Sarah just sounded extraordinary. Talking back to the book, Anne, I asked you earlier, you wrote a poem. There's just one poem in the book, which you wrote about John's piano, because you had to eventually let the piano go, and changed the room around with the sofa, making it a little bit more livable. And so you wrote a poem about this, and I wondered if you'd read out. It's on page 198. If you'd like to read the piano.
Well, when you say let the piano go, I was happy to let the piano go because his other daughter had it. Well, I will read it now. The piano. The grand piano has left the house to live with your daughter as you wish. For 30 years, it sat, elegant and polished, in the stunning room you created in our house. In my direct line of vision, from the desk I use many hours a day, you sat there long after you weren't available for practice. The gaping hole in the room echoes the cavernous hole in my heart, where you live and still live, but where, like the piano, I can no longer see you. Just to cut through that.
Yes, very beautiful. Thank you. There's so much I want to talk about, and there are people asking questions here as well, and lots of positive comments and a few questions that I want to ask you. But one of the things also that you talk about here is what you call sadmin. Again, Catherine's brilliant use of words. So the sadmin. So it's all It is extraordinary. We've touched on it earlier, the amount of bureaucratic paperwork that's got to be done. And in both cases, with John and Andy hadn't signed their wills. Was that the case?
John had a will, but he hadn't signed. He had a will dating from the 90s.
But he hadn't changed it. He hadn't signed the new one.
Signed the one we did in 2018. So we had to use an older one, but he did have a will, whereas Andy did not. And fewer than 50% of all the adults in this country have a will.
Yeah, I've got one somewhere. I don't even know where it is.
Well, that's serious stuff. Actually.
Yes, it's serious stuff. Yes. So just taking control of your finances, both Anne and you, Catherine, getting access. I mean, one of the things, such a simple thing that you wrote in here is like, don't cancel your partner or the beloved, the lovely dead's phone straight away, because you need it to keep verifying, to get into the accounts that you need to change and do things with, and just the complications. I had a wonderful cousin who was a specialist lawyer who looked after my mother's estate and made things much easier for my sister and I. But it is even so, the bureaucracy and the waiting around and the probate, it's a huge thing in itself. So you've got, I just felt, I guess that's perhaps what Death Cafes, and that's not necessarily your role in life, but there is so much that people who have experienced it can teach others that we do need to talk about.
Yeah.
And do you see some kind of way that the book will create a community or a group?
I hope one person that I know very well, who lost her husband about 3 or 4 years ago, said one of the things she loved about the book was that it brought bereavement out of the closet and into the light.
Yes.
And I think if that makes it possible, I've had calls from people I don't know saying, would you tell me about this or that? I think if that opens up pathways for people to talk, both about the practical things, like
Yes.
one person rang me up and said, hello, I'm so-and-so, could you tell me all about probate? Well, frankly, I'm not a lawyer and I can only tell her my experience of probate. But I think if we can create that openness, that people can talk to each other about both practical things and about the way they feel.
Yes. You've got, I'm just going to tell you one greeting here, because it may be a dear friend. If it's not, it's somebody that certainly wants to say hello. Is Maureen Sanderson from Chicago is sending you greetings. Does that sound familiar? No? Well, anyway, we're getting lots.
It's her hometown.
What?
It's my hometown.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. It might be someone you know.
Ask her what her maiden name was.
Oh, Maureen, we need your maiden name. Catherine, I just want to ask you to read something out from the book. It's page 207. And you were talked about the love that you and Andy had for each other and your relationship. And you also bring in what he said about you. So just starting on the paragraph that starts, Andy and I built. Have you got that there? Would you read that out?
Okay. Andy and I had built over many years a transformative level of trust. It wasn't about whether we would always behave well towards each other, but about what would happen when we didn't. We had confidence that our relationship would endure. Like swans, we had mated for life. This knowledge freed both of us to pursue ambitions and projects that might have destroyed a love less robust. He toured and got caught up in the creative process, always a new track on the go, always a fragment of lyric turning over in his mind. My work was similarly absorbing. At the end of every absence of the body or the mind, we returned home, re-engaged, slotted back into our joint life. The thing is, he told the Sunday Times of our relationship, if you get along and you know you can go through some of the rough patches, it really is an enormous adventure. Asked to name something about me he prizes, he gives an answer that makes my heart swell, and yes, my head too. I think she's dead right, that keeps me very interested. Is there a memory that he cherishes from the early days? So many, he replies. She doesn't do this so much now, but if she really got hysterical, she'd fall against the wall and then collapse onto the floor, laughing so hard, which I find very endearing.
You follow that up by saying you can't remember the last time you laughed to the point of collapse, and understandably so. But are you laughing? You still see you see humor in things because it's such a crazy life and crazy world.
It's like horribly funny, a lot of what's going on. And like one of the reasons we compiled the list of sort of unfortunate things that people had said to us is also because it is really funny. Like there is a black bleak humor in a lot of what's going on, and it's important to, it really is important to recognize it and to enjoy it. You know, there's an absurdity to it.
Yeah, there is an absurdity. I'm just looking at these, I'm listening and I'm looking. Lots of very positive quotes. If anybody wants to ask some specific questions, there's one question here from Sarah Winnington, who's part of our Seed Tribe, and she says, such intense grief, how have they got through it? What self-care strategies have they adopted? Would you say you have some self-care strategies you'd like to share?
Yeah, I can see my mother making a face as if she doesn't, and in fact, she's the one who walks up and down her staircase. How many times a day?
But that's only when because I can't go to Pilates and all my stuff.
My point is, you have an exercise routine,
Yeah.
and we both try really hard to eat properly as well.
And,
Yeah.
And you've got your can of pale ale.
I was living a fairly healthy life before John died, so I haven't, radically changed anything.
Well, I did read that you do this 30 times a day,
up and down my steps.
and I felt rather guilty when I was thinking about me. I think Maureen Sanderson is somebody I know, actually, ironically. So she's in Chicago. And anyway, so lots of lovely comments and people thanking you for the honest, open talk about grief and so much more. And so many people saying that. So when you talk about self-care, I mean, I know eating well is important. I think sort of relaxing in the evening, Anne. I know a glass of white wine for you and a can of pale ale. There you go.
Yeah.
So, certainly helps. But I guess again, it's having the support of friends and community and tribe, even if it's Zoom. I think you have Zoom dinner parties once a week with your family, isn't that?
We did for a while. Now they're more sporadic, but we had mayor dinners once a week for the first bit of the lockdown.
Yeah.
And then the kids, they're not kids, but my 3 and John's 1 you have a regular Zoom with them, don't you, Kath?
Yeah, again, it's kind of irregular, regular. But I mean, I did. We had some counselling together, my sisters and I.
Yes.
And that was very helpful. But it was helpful in giving us a framework to talk about grief. And I think one of the things that's been important was to understand, my mother and I, the one thing that we don't have to assert to the world is that we are grieving. People understand that of widows. But for people like my sisters who are utterly bereft at having lost both John and Andy, but don't have that kind of status within society because, what are they? They're stepdaughters or, sisters.
Except your stepsister is Catherine. I'm
talking about my sisters now, but because they're the ones I did the counselling with, they were John's stepsisters and then they were Andy's sister-in-laws, and people don't expect those people to be prostrate with grief, and yet they clearly are. They're still really suffering. And so I think one of the things about grief is understanding the kind of community and commonalities of it. And in that sense, that was in a funny way, one of the most useful things about the counselling was to understand how much we shared there.
Yeah, there's a lot of gratitude just for the people on this call that are writing on it, saying how much they appreciate you sharing, because it's helping them with how they're dealing with things or how their understanding of what to deal with. And this last letter you wrote to John that's in the book, although you say you've been carrying on writing letters and they will be published as well.
We're very close to your time limit. Do you still want me to?
Yeah, we are, but that's okay. The last paragraph, I mean, I'm all right for time if you're all right for time. We don't get cut off.
I thought you had to end the day.
We kind of do, but we're not that rigid here. We won't be long, but on 217, there's just
yeah, you want me to just read the final paragraph?
Yeah, please. Yes, please.
Is this the letter I wrote to myself? Yeah,
Oh, yes, it is.
Yes,
It's a letter you wrote to yourself.
I converted a letter I originally wrote to John, to me, and it was written in the summer. So it concludes, so how am I after 7 months of solitude? Better, calmer, and braver than I would have anticipated. Incurably lonely and sad, horribly unsure of the future, personal and national. Grateful beyond belief for the support of my family, particularly my twin widow, Catherine. But, and this is the most surprising thing, still utterly recognizably myself, learning to value and rely on myself, making the good thing to come out of a succession of very bad things. That, and not ever losing hope, and the desire to live every day I have left to the full.
Beautiful, just beautiful. And Catherine, just briefly, I mean, you're carrying on, of course, being very involved with Women's Equality Party and the Prima Donna Festival. Do you want to just briefly explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that, again, has been lucky for me in terms of getting through this was I have things I'm incredibly passionate about, besides writing, which I'm passionate about. But so the Women's Equality Party, as I said, has been very busy. And Prima Donna Festival, we founded it, we did the first one in 2019. And of course, as it turned out, the only in-person one so far. And it was a festival founded to put women front and center in a festival of creativity. It's not women only, but it's, I think the first one, those sort of 80% of the participants were women. And it was also voices from the margins. So a lot of people who wouldn't normally appear at literary festivals. And I wrote the slogan for it, which is "The world as it should be for one weekend." And one of the really exciting things about it was it was an absolutely blissful 3-day event. And at the end of it, it had actually created a vision for people of the world as it should be, to your point about rebuilding a better world out of where we are now. I think the only way, and this is where Prima Donna and the Women's Equality Party are very linked, the only way we get to a better world is if we actually imagine what that world looks like and then build towards it. And so in very different ways, those two organisations do that. We're hoping to be able to do an in-person festival with Prima Donna later this year, but who knows? But it has continued to go from strength to strength, even though in spite of
I'm looking
lockdown.
forward to being there and listening in the audience. And what you just said is absolutely clear for me. That's just what I see for Seed as well, is if we want this new kind of way of living and working and being, we have to vision it. We have to see what this world can be and look like and talk about it with each other, and we can then make it happen. That's
we have to look beyond the end of lockdown, whenever that may be, and put our world back together.
And use this time of pause to start visioning. I mean, I know we are. And I hope I'll be talking to both of you, and particularly Catherine, with all the work that we've kind of touched on and done together and connected over the years. I
noticed one of your listeners just flashed up a thing saying, Catherine, we should write a follow-up book.
Yes, absolutely. They want to know if you're already writing the follow-up. I think that, I mean, this is just fantastic work here, but also I think the follow-up, well, anyway, it's up to you what you write. But I'm looking forward to seeing your vision of what that future can look like. What that future can look like for the children and the grandchildren and the 7 generations to come, as the Indigenous people say. So there's one quote I want to say about this book, which, by the way, we sell at the Seed store. We're going to use in our new Seed book club. And if anybody, of course, the book you can find, but you can certainly find it at our website, which is seed-store.org. And this quote finally from Sandy Toksvig, your great friend and co-creator of the Women's Equality Party and wonderful woman, the most life-affirming book ever written about death. And I love that quote. I love that quote because this is a life-affirming book. You two are life-affirming. You're amazing women, and the rest of the mayors that I've met over the years are pretty amazing too. And I hope I'll be seeing a lot more of you. And I'm just going to quickly, yes, everybody's saying thank you and they've loved it and you ladies rock. beautiful, many blessings, so much grace and gratitude. This has been brilliant, so much resonates. I believe we need to talk about grief and death more. Thank you so much. I feel so privileged to have been part of this evening. Thank you, Catherine and Anne, for sharing your stories. And Lottie's put up where you can get your copy of the book from. Thank you. The session was so very special, taken so much away with me, so inspiring. Thank you, amazing. I think everybody's been, it's more about just how blown away everybody is rather than questions, because I think they've enjoyed so much. So we are absolutely 1 minute over time. So I want to thank you. If anybody in the seed room wants to stay on to talk things through, if you feel like it, I'm going to keep the seed room open for now. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody on StreamYard or on our other media pages. Oh, God, technology is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love it.
Well,
And I
for
thank you
inviting me.
so much. I am really so moved. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. And Catherine, let's connect with a Zoom whenever we can.
Thanks,
so
Lynne.
much
Thanks
love,
so
much
much.
gratitude, and thank you for being
Thank
here.
you.
God bless. Bye.